Welcome into the PFN Bengals Podcast. I am Dallas Robinson. He is Jay Morrison, as always. And today we have a guest, PFN draft analyst Ian Cummings, who gave us all the best information during the draft leading up to the draft. Yep. Now, Ian, it's time to talk about these undrafted free agents. First of all, how are you doing now that the draft is over? Have you had time to decompress and relax a little bit? And then number two, are you excited to get into UDFAs, or are you kind of like ready to put the draft in the rearview window at this point?
Yes and no. It's always a fun, when you're into it like I am, you see players that you really like that end up going undrafted, right? So you want to see where they go, where they can carve out a role. So that part of it is very fun. I have gotten a little bit of time to decompress, not enough time, but a little bit. We're going on vacation next week, so I've got that on the docket. I'm kind of looking forward to that. But at the same time, we've had a little bit of time to look forward to 2025, take a really early look at the QBs for the next class, and eventually we'll have another mock coming out, but that'll be a little bit farther in the future. But it's been a fun time. It's been grueling, but it's been fun. And the UDFA cycle is another one. I know that UDFAs, people, there tends to be more glamour for being a draft pick, right? But a lot of good players fall, and a lot of good players go undrafted. So I think if you find the right situation, you can carve out a role. So I'm very intrigued to see, where guys go and what they do.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk this year about, for whatever reason, the guys staying around longer, or who knows why, but that this was a really thin draft on the back end. Like there was a drop off after the fourth, fifth round. And I don't know. It seems to me like there are a lot of quality undrafted free agents. I don't know if some teams, I can't imagine they would pass over a guy that was higher on their board, but there is a strategy to it where it's a guy you really, really want, you draft him, make sure nobody else can get him. But if it's a guy you feel pretty good about, that you've had talks with leading up to, and you feel like you can sign him, then maybe you do kind of roll the dice and wait and grab a guy like that. But I know you haven't like dove into this entire UDFA class, but do you think, is it on par with what we've seen in the last couple of years, or has it, like the draft, kind of fallen off a little bit?
I think it's on par. I think the best way that I can describe it, I think there were two factors at play. The COVID year, right? So a lot of guys went back, and then NIL as well. I think mainly what got chipped away at was kind of that mid to late round pocket of prospects, guys who could maybe gain stock with another year, right? So using that COVID year to maybe improve your stock if you want more development, or guys that are good enough players at the collegiate level where they can get some NIL from a transfer, right? Cameron Ward going from Washington State to Miami is a great example of that. Like, had he declared, he probably would have been a mid to late quarterback. I don't know if he's going to improve his stock because there are some red flags on the tape, but he's a guy who's talented enough where he's gonna get a lot of money just from NIL going to a certain school. So I think NIL, COVID year, both of those things in different ways incentivized players in a certain draft range to go back, but there are always players that are exhausting eligibility and have to declare. And I think the UDFA pool can be enriched by that too. So I don't think the UDFA pool was any weaker. I think maybe the round 4 to round 7 range was a little weaker.
Yeah.
I think before we dive into these UDFAs, I did want to get your thoughts on the Bengals' actual draft class, right? We haven't talked to you since the Bengals took 10 guys in the first 7 rounds there. From Amarius Mims in round 1 to Chris Jenkins in round 2, Jermaine Burton, kind of a surprise pick in round 3, all the way down to Florida center Matt Lee in round 7. Was there a favorite prospect, Ian, that you had among this group of Bengals prospects, and what were your kind of overall thoughts on how the Bengals addressed their needs in this draft?
Yeah, so I really liked what they did. I remember we were talking about defensive tackles for a little bit, during the pre-draft pod, and Chris Jenkins was one of those guys who really good run defender right off the bat from 3 tech. He can play some strong side 5 tech if he wanted to, and he's got a ton of pass rushing upside, right? I think the biggest thing for him is the sequencing as a pass rusher with his hands and his feet can definitely improve, but you have all of the necessary tools to work with. So I like that fit. And they have Sheldon Rankins as well. So I think they have some good variety in that 3 tech room. And then you got McKinley Jackson, who is one of our guys that we were talking about at length, is one of those guys kind of in the round 3, round 4 fringe, who could be that nose tackle candidate for you. I think he has room to kind of improve his leveraging a little bit. He's got that natural leverage being 6'1", 320, but can improve it, aligning his base to avoid playing upright and getting moved off the spot, but near 34-inch arms. So that natural leverage proportional length combo is very appealing with him, and he's got some explosion and twitch and juice as a pass rushing threat too. So fun one. Jermaine Burton, if he can stay straight and narrow, if he can stay, focused and dialed in, that could be a top 5 receiving trio in the league. Like, for the 1 year that you have T. Higgins left, if you don't extend him, right, we still don't really know what's going to happen long term with that situation. But Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Jermaine Burton, man, that is such a fun trio. Jermaine Burton can separate. He can stress vertically. He can make tough catches. He can do pretty much anything you need him to. So I really like the upside of that pick. I'm very excited to see what they can do. Amarius Mims, very good developmental tackle who can be an impact starter in a year or two, right? And you don't have to start him right away. So that's the appeal there. Eric All and Tanner McLaughlin were two of my favorite sleeper tight ends, right? So I think one of those guys will become a starter, I believe, at some point. Eric All has some injury issues, right? Tanner McLaughlin is a former wide receiver, so he's more of a natural separator, not quite the blocking presence it all is, but they're both pretty good players. And then I think Matt Lee was one of my favorite picks too, because he's athletic, he's experienced. I think he can be legit. He could be the successor for Ted Karras at center too. So a lot of fun picks. I think they did a great job. I'd give them an A or A minus probably if I had to give a grade off the top of my head. I thought they hit a lot of spots and got a lot of good value.
Yeah, I had gone back and looked at where the guys were on your big board, top 300 ranking, and then where they were actually drafted. And Matt Lee was the biggest value pick. I mean, you had him much higher as far as a prospect, and he somehow stuck around to the 7th round. So I agree. I think that could be a sneaky pick. Going back to what you said about the NIL on the previous question, and then going back with talking about Eric All. So I went to Eric's former high school, which is my former high school, and talked to him and his head coach. And it was funny. When I was walking out, the head coach is like, I had to go pick him up. He's like, I didn't even think about it, but we had this thing set up, and he's like, Coach, I need a ride to get there. And he's like, what happened to that nice Durango you were driving around? He's like, that was NIL. He's like, I had to give it back when I left Iowa. So this guy, he doesn't have a car. He's worried about how he's going to get to rookie camp right now. It's funny because yes, eventually he's going to sign a contract, get a nice signing bonus, but you forget about these kids coming right out of school and is dealing with what a lot of people coming right out of school. You gotta worry about that. And Eric All, another story with him. He last week he was wanting to work out at his old high school, and it was in the evening. So he went to his he got his parents' car, went to his coach's home, got the keys, and then the coach said at 10:30 at night he got a call from Eric, and he's like, "Where's the jugs machine?" And he's like, "What are you talking?" And he's like, "The jugs machine. I'm going to catch some passes." And he's like, it's 10:30 at night. And he's like, it's under the bleachers. It's in the cage. That key's on there. And he got it out. And obviously it's nighttime, so he can't do it out on the field. You can't turn the lights on. So he wheeled it all the way into the visitors' locker room and was catching jugs passes. He's just itching to get out there because the last couple of weeks, he hasn't really been able to do any rehab. Now that he's waiting to sign this contract, you don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardize that. So he's itching to get out there and do some things. And right now, catching jugs at 10:30 at night in a locker room is about the extent of what he can do.
It's a fun story, man.
That's some dedication right there.
You love to see the drive, especially because like with rookies, you only have a select number of practice reps, right? And a lot of times, especially during the season, those practice reps have to be spent on install. So you want these guys to be itching to put that work in off the field on their own time too. So it's great to see that he's doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, man, that's a really, really good story, Jay. Let's get into these UDFAs here. Let's just start at the top with quarterback. Now, the Bengals have Joe Burrow. They have Jake Browning on their active roster. Obviously, they signed Logan Woodside, who's been in Cincinnati before as a practice squad option. But they also signed Rocky Lombardi from Northern Illinois. Right? This is a guy who is a 7th-year senior, played at Northern Illinois. He's going to be 26 years old this summer. Is this a guy you think, Ian, that has an NFL future? Like, even if it's just maybe as that kind of third quarterback, emergency quarterback, is this a guy you think could come in and compete, has the NFL skills to actually play in this league, or is he a guy we might not be thinking about after this summer?
I think, my gut reaction is I watched him play a little bit at Michigan State, and I think he developed a little bit at Northern Illinois, but in general, he was always more of that guy who he's very athletic. I mean, that's the first thing that comes up, right? I think he's around 6'4", over 215, ran a 4.7 40-yard dash, really good explosion numbers too. So this is a guy who, if you want to be creative, a little chaotic, you can maybe get him in like a Taysom Hill kind of role, right? But I think in general, I'm looking at him as a QB3 practice squad quarterback, right? Who's got really good athleticism, who has a decent arm, not a great arm, but a decent arm, right? But a lot of the QBing things that you want QBs to be good at, right? Like one reason Jake Browning was so good coming in relief of Joe Burrow is because he could keep the offense on schedule. He was a little more accurate. Those things aren't quite strong suits for Rocky Lombardi. So I think there's always potential to improve those things. But I think right now his chief appeal is that he's a guy who's athletic. He's got a strong frame, prototypical, decent arm, right? So toughness as well is not a lacking quality with him either. So I think the perfect guy to get in your QB rotation is at 3 or 4 and just kind of let him get those reps and see what comes of it.
Yeah, I mean, Logan Woodside's played games in this league. He doesn't have any starts, so I think that's a good spot to take a flyer on a guy, and maybe he comes in and he beats Logan Woodside out for that number 3 spot. And he's a guy that, it's a little derogatory, but you say a camp arm. It's a guy that can take some of the reps. There's so many more reps in training camp, and we're still a ways to go to get to training camp. But it will be interesting to see. You look at the depth of this quarterback. I mean, after what Browning did last year, you think the Bengals have probably one of the deepest quarterback rooms in the league now. With how many third string quarterbacks have double digit game appearances in the league? A lot of them are the undrafted guys are just kind of hanging around waiting for a shot. So I'm interested to see, and that he's as Ian said, he's almost 26 or I think you said that, Dallas, but he's been around. Yeah. He's played a lot of ball. So he's used to digesting offenses and playbooks, and it's going to be interesting to watch that. I don't think we're going to see a lot of him, but when he is out there, it'll be fun to see how that translates and if he can beat out Logan Woodside.
And that's a good point to make, is that, moving from Michigan State to Northern Illinois, he did have to learn a new offense, right? So there is that skill to it. It's a double-edged sword being older, because you have experience, you've changed scenery as well, and you've dealt with that. But then things like accuracy and bad habits with mechanics, those things might be a little more ironed in as well if you're older, right? Yeah. So you might be more set in your ways. So that's the trade-off that you risk with him. But I agree with both of you. I think camp arm, he's got the athleticism for sure. I think he's one of the more physically talented QBs in that room. So just get him the reps and see if he can make something out of it, right? There's only potential energy here. So see if he can see that through.
At 57 years old, I have a lot of bad habits that are ironed in.
Yeah. Hey, I'm a little on the younger side, but I've got a lot of bad habits over here too. So we all understand that. Let's get to linebackers, Ian. This is a question from one of our listeners, from Johnny. Is there any concern about the Bengals linebacker position? Logan Wilson is solid, but he feels like Jermaine Pratt took a step back last year. Is it a position that's just not as valued as much in Lou Anarumo's defense? And then specifically about these undrafted free agents the Bengals signed, do these 2 UDFA linebackers have a chance to make the roster? The Bengals signed Aaron Casey from Indiana. I believe he was the only UDFA the Bengals signed who was on Ian's big board. He was number 203 on the big board. I think he was the only UDFA on that list. And then we've got Wisconsin's either Mema or Muma Zhang Meta. I don't know. We were discussing this pronunciation before the show. We're still not exactly sure how to go in there. But linebacker is a position, I think, where there is an opportunity for one of these UDFAs to potentially make the roster. Ian, what are your thoughts on Aaron Casey and Zhang Meta from Wisconsin? Do you think they actually have a chance to make this depth chart?
Yeah, for sure. And real quick, I want to ask you guys, because you're more tuned in with the Cincinnati Bengals. I looked it up a lot for mock drafts, but I've forgotten now because I flushed all that out for space for 2025 prospects. So Jermaine Pratt, did he get re-signed long-term, or was it more of a short-term deal?
Yeah, I think it was 3 years.
3 years?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But they've got an out after this year if they want, and with little dead cap hit. So 2 more for sure, but 1 absolutely.
And then the third
linebacker. I'm sorry, 1 for sure. And
yeah. And then is Akeem Davis Gaither still the top guy in that third linebacker spot?
But
he just re-signed. He re-signed on a 1-year deal and Bocce.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because I think looking at the future situation for the linebacking core, I think Aaron Casey could make the roster. I think he could. I think, and I believe I might have mentioned him on our previous pre-draft, if I remember correctly. I might have. I can't remember. But he's one of those. He was one of my favorite day 3 watches on the tape. Muma Zhang Meta is another one that I think has some intrigue, but I think he might be more one-dimensional. It's that Sam linebacker, right? Who's really only got utility in the box, right? He ran a slow 40. I think that lack of full field range and explosion does show up on tape, where he's kind of confined. He's a dense bowling ball. He's so physical coming downhill too, but that's kind of his deal, right? That's the only thing that he can really do. He can tackle, he can take on blocks, but if you need him to change direction or provide coverage utility, get depth quickly, match up tight ends, like not going to be able to do any of those things. So I think Zhang Meta probably makes it as that Sam linebacker. If you can really make an impression, because he's pretty limited athletically, but he is physical, he is strong, he is powerful. So those things are there. Aaron Casey, I think, has a little bit more dynamic potential, and he could get some special teams ability in there too. He's around 6'1", 230, 32-inch arms, so really good build. He's got good compact weight and mass and pretty good proportional length too. He ran a 4.69 40-yard dash at a 34-inch vertical. So he's a solid athlete, not an elite athlete, and that shows up on film, but enough explosion to work downhill. And he had 20 tackles for loss in 2023. I mean, this dude was productive downhill day in and day out. The game against Ohio State was really what sold me on him, because every single play, man, he's triggering, he's processing gaps quickly, he's attacking, he's getting to the ball behind the line of scrimmage, penetrating gaps, flowing to the football, and just making plays. I think he's got that ability as a tackler, as a block deconstructor, the motor. I think there is a scenario where, and I think the Bengals with Logan Wilson and Jermaine Pratt, if they run more odd fronts, it'll be more of a 5-2 look where you have guys, two linebackers and the nickel defender outside, right? So not always three linebackers on the field, but when you do have that third linebacker on early downs, I really love Aaron Casey's ability to get downhill quickly, to combat blocks, and to make tackles behind the line of scrimmage. So he's instinctive, explosive, physical, really high motor guy. If I could bet money on a Bengals UDFA to make the roster, Aaron Casey would probably be one of my top picks, because I really love the day 3 tape and the potential there.
Yeah, when they didn't draft one, I thought maybe they would go back and re-sign Marcus Bailey, but they signed these two guys in undrafted free agency. I'm curious, you weren't the only one that had a draftable grade on Aaron Casey, so where's the but? Like you mentioned all of his good attributes. Why do you think he went undrafted? What's the hitch there with it's not linking with teams?
The biggest thing for me would be, and to be fair, good players do go undrafted sometimes. Sometimes it just happens, but usually when they do, it's because there is something that's limiting them, right? I think the biggest thing for him is that he's not an elite athlete, right? He ran a 4.69, 34-inch vertical, but you can see the full field range isn't there. It's there a little bit more with him than it is with John Meta, right? But I do think Casey's utility is still going to be strongest in the box, where he's more confined between the hashes and he can just attack downhill, right, and cut off angles. When he has to make up ground in pursuit or match up against the tight end and limit vertical separation and coverage, not super good in that role either, right? He's probably, and I think I think if you compare him and John Meta, I do think Casey is a little bit more coverage utility as well, right? So I think just everything that John Meta can do, Casey can do a little bit better. But I do think there is still some limitations with the coverage ability, right? I think he's probably going to be confined to a guy who can drop into short and intermediate zones and just kind of patrol zones, but not a guy that you really want manning up or swiveling his hips or recovering ground, right? So I think with him, he is more confined to that attacking role as well. I just think Aaron Casey can be very good in that role. And so that's why I'm pretty bullish on the projection, especially alongside Logan Wilson.
Okay.
Yeah, even if Akeem Davis-Gaither is making his team as a third linebacker, and even if Joe Baki makes as the fourth linebacker, there's still room for that fifth linebacker. There's Shaka Hayward's on this roster, Devin Harper, but John Meta and Casey, I think you're absolutely right, have like every opportunity to grab that fifth linebacker spot. I think it's going to come down to what Darren Simmons thinks. I think right. Special teams coordinator, right, is which guy I think stands out over the summer and shows he can work on teams and maybe have a little bit of that upside that Ian talked about. I think that's really interesting. Let's talk about running back. Greg Luther, one of our listeners, asked, will any of the UDFA running backs make the team? Another position at running back that I think Jay and I were surprised that the Bengals did not address on the draft. Like, we didn't think they were taking a linebacker or running back on days 1 or 2, but both of us thought that, rounds 5, 6, 7, that's where you could add these depth pieces. Instead, they wait till UDFA for running back as well. They go after Noah Cain from LSU and Elijah Collins from Oklahoma State. I think running back's another position behind Zach Moss and behind Chase Brown where there's plenty of opportunity, right? There's Travion Williams, there's Chris Evans are on this roster, but if Noah Cain and Elijah Collins or either one of them shows anything over the summer, over training camp, I don't think there's any doubt there is a situation where one of them could take over for a Travion Williams or a Chris Evans and eventually make this roster. Ian, what are your thoughts on these two guys, Cain and Collins, as they're coming out of college?
Yeah, and Cain, I'll admit, I didn't get to watch a ton of down the stretch. I remember I watched a little bit when he was at Penn State. Has decent burst, physicality, right? Good frame density. If I remember correctly, a little bit one-dimensional as a weapon in the passing phase, but I do think he has some ability with his physicality and vertical explosion downhill. So I'm intrigued to see what he can do. Elijah Collins is another one who playing for Michigan State, I live close to East Lansing, so I was seeing a lot of him back in 2019 when he had that breakout year where he almost got 1,000 yards. He was the workhorse as a sophomore or redshirt freshman, so pretty early on. Injuries kind of slowed his role at that point, and eventually he transferred to Oklahoma State, where he was kind of a rotational back. But he's an intriguing one, I do think. Elijah Collins, around 6 foot. I think he measured close to 215. So he's got pretty good size, and he's got pretty good energy as a runner as well. He's explosive. I think he ran a 4.51, had a 38-inch vertical again. So, explosion, enough speed to work with on the vertical plane. If you're comparing Michigan State backs, Kenneth Walker was the standard with fluidity and bend. Collins isn't near that point, when it comes to cutting, fluidity, and flexibility, right? I think Collins is more of that twitched up lateral mover who can, offset with some quick one-cut moves and then get upfield with that verticality. And he's got some decent physicality too. I think he can absorb solo tackles pretty well. Again, like Kane, a little one-dimensional in the passing phase. I think Kane might actually have a little more passing utility than Collins does. Collins didn't really take on much volume at all as a pass catcher at the collegiate level. But if you need a running back, who can provide some change of pace ability, the explosion is there. I think there's enough contact balance and physicality. Just staying healthy will be the key for him because, again, as a pass catcher and a pass blocker, not the best in those compartments. And especially for running backs and UDFA running backs, what a good way to get on the field is, provide that two-phase element where you can protect the quarterback and catch passes. So I don't know if either of these guys have that to that elite degree. So that's why I'm a little hesitant. The rotation is, not a ton of depth, top-end depth, but at the same time, I don't see any of those two-phase weapons in this group. But I'm intrigued. I think, with the right opportunity, if they can make the most of it, they could potentially sneak onto the roster.
Yeah, they could be kind of what I said about Rocky, where, just camp bodies that you need guys to take these reps, and they didn't draft somebody, so they had to go out and get a couple. It is worth noting, some people might look at a back like Kyle, a rotational guy, and think that's a knock, but the Bengals actually target those guys. They really like that a lot. Guys that split time in college because they come into the pros with less wear and tear on their bodies, and Elijah did not split time. I mean, he was behind Ollie Gordon, who was like he won the Doak Walker Award. I mean, he was incredible. So there weren't a lot of opportunities for him. But I think what they did is an endorsement of some sort for Chris Evans, because I had already kind of written him off as not making this team. And I think he's probably likely to beat out these two guys this year and stick around for one more year. But because he has what he can do in the pass game. And as you said, these guys they haven't proven it yet. So I'm not sure that anybody should be betting on either one of these guys to make the roster, but they are going to need running backs on the practice squad. And you could see one or both of those guys sticking around through the year in that capacity.
Let's go to the defensive side of the ball. Bengals Storm on Twitter wanted to ask specifically about Justin Blazek. So this is an edge rusher who got 19.5 sacks in 26 starts, but it came at Wisconsin Platteville, which is not a school I was necessarily familiar with heading into this draft cycle. The Bengals have edge depth, right? They've got their starters. They drafted Miles Murphy last year in round 1, but guys like Cameron Sample and Joseph Osai are heading into their final years of their rookie contract. So long-term, there could be a need here. Blazek is a guy I think he's got the production that the Bengals are looking for, but is he the type of athletic specimen I think that could play in the NFL, or will that small school stature kind of hinder him?
Yeah, he's a fun player. I think he could potentially make some noise and maybe sneak onto the roster. I know they got Cedric Johnson as well as the developmental edge rusher who has the superior physical tools, but Justin Blazek is pretty intriguing to me. I didn't get a chance to rank him on my big board, but I did watch a little bit of him just for this podcast, just to make sure I could provide some info there.
Thank you.
You're welcome anytime. 6'3", 252 pounds, I think 32.5-inch arms, somewhere around there. So not elite size or power profile, right? And I think he ran in the mid 4.8s too. So you're not working with elite speed around the arc. That said, I think he had a 36.5-inch vertical, and that does show up on tape where he can get off the line pretty quickly. He times the snap well, which is evidence in his production. He's going to be a consistent force off the snap. He can play from a 2-point stance or a 3-point stance. He can rush, with that explosion. He's got pretty good hand usage as well. You got cross chops, double swipes at the apex. Those are good parts of his game. And he's got some decent hip flexibility too. I do think he can roll his hips past the apex, reduce the surface area a little bit, not an elite bend guy, but enough functional bend for his size where he can work and kind of compound hand moves and stack off of that. So I do think as a pass rusher and as a high motor pursuit defender, there is a lot to like. Doesn't have elite playmaking range in pursuit with that lacking speed, but he's a high motor guy who has a decent pass rush arsenal and decent bend and flexibility, which are traits that allow you to finish reps more consistently. So I think with that motor, with that decent, solid flexibility, he could potentially, and that burst off the line as well. I do think maybe he could find his way into a rotation as maybe a third or fourth edge. I think maximum projection, right? I don't think he's ever going to become a starter for you, maybe not even a pass rush specialist, right? But every now and then we do see guys who fill out the rotation as depth, with their motor in the pursuit phase and, their decent workman-like pass rushing ability. So Justin Blazek stood out to me within that lens, right? Again, doesn't have the upside to be that top tier kind of player, but I do think as a rotational presence, there is something to work with.
He really intrigues me because, he's what the Bengals go for. He's a 3-year captain. And They love that kind of thing. But, he produced early on and he was a captain. He was so important to that team. And with the portal now, I'm just curious why. I'm looking forward to talking to him when I do get a chance. And why didn't he go somewhere bigger? And why did he stick it out at Wisconsin-Platteville all that time? You would think, okay, maybe he's from that area and he wanted to be close to family. He's not. He's from Illinois, which Illinois and Wisconsin aren't super far apart, but it's not his home. So I am really intrigued why a guy like that, who's just tearing it up at that level, didn't make that leap and try to give himself a better chance at more exposure. And I'm sure he had his reasons, but as Dallas said, 19 and a half sacks in college. And there's, a potential again Trey Hendrickson said he requested the trade. I don't think he's going to sit out in camp, but that's always a possibility. And so you've got guys like Cedric Johnson and Blazek that can come in and take some of those reps in camp. But yeah, I think he might be more of a project, and then they see if they don't bring back Sample and Osai, like you said, Ian, then you've got a guy who's already got a year in the system who could kind of step in next year and see if maybe he can be a rotational guy for Lou.
I want to talk about the punter. I think we have to. I want to talk about Austin McNamara. Ian, I don't know if you scout punters. Like, you've got so many other prospects to look at. Punters are probably not on your radar, but the Bengals are going to have a punting competition this summer. Brad Robbins was there. It was a 6th-round pick last year, had a pretty bad rookie season. Austin McNamara, we've talked about Puntalytics many times, our friends on this show. They had him ranked as the number 2 punter in this draft behind Torrey Taylor from Iowa. Torrey Taylor went in the 4th round. It was the only punter drafted. Puntalytics said that Austin McNamara could have been drafted as high as the 5th. So he didn't get drafted at all, but I think he has a very good chance to come in here and compete with Brad Robbins. Whether he'll take that starting punting job or not is an open question. Ian, any thoughts on this punter battle? I don't want to put you on the spot with a punting question here, but any thoughts on Austin McNamara and what he could potentially bring to the Bengals?
For any, and I won't pretend to know more. I'm not. There's so much ground to cover with other positions. I usually can't get to specialists. I'll defer to Ali. Ali Hodgkinson at PFN for that. He is the specialist, and he gets on my case all the time for not ranking them, right? Because I just have so many other players. He's like, where's your punter, man? Torrey Taylor, top 100. Come on. It's like, Ali, I got a lot to cover here, man. I'm sorry, but I would never spend capital on a kicker. I would rarely spend. If I had extra capital on day 3, then I would do it. But rarely would I spend capital, just because you can get a guy like Austin McNamara in the UDFA pool. Usually, I think usually the specialist positions are deep enough that you can play the patient game and get someone like that. From what I've heard, has a pretty good leg, has good size. I think he can pin it deep when he needs to. And I especially with the punter position, so much is just staying locked in and getting the right positioning, right? Because Brad Robbins and all the other inconsistent punters that we've seen in the past, right? It's just mainly not being locked in, not having the right pinpoint precision. So I'm intrigued by the battle battle, right? As intrigued as I can be about a special teams battle. But, I do think the Bengals played it right. I think with their 10 picks in the draft, they got some guys who could provide talent, Matt Lee in day 3, the 2 tight ends, right? Guys who have the upside at positions that could provide a lot more value on offense and defense. But, as a punter, making that UDFA swing on McNamara, I think it could have great returns, because I do think, from everything I've heard, he was a draftable talent and they got him for a good value.
Yeah, and I think he's going to stick around. Even if Brad Robbins beats him out, I think there'll still be enough trepidation in the back of their minds that, what if it goes south again with Brad Robbins? And, unless Austin just has a terrible camp and Brad destroys him in the competition, with 16 practice squad spots now, I could absolutely see them keeping McNamara around as a just in case. We saw it a couple of years ago where Huber beat out Chrisman. They kept Chrisman around. Finally, I think it was week 10, week 11, they pulled the trigger and replaced Huber for Chrisman. I could see them doing that again. Even though the competition ends when the 53 is announced, that still kind of keeps a little bit of a fire under Brad Robbins, knowing that his potential replacement is still in the building. They're still kind of competing in practices. So I'd be surprised if they don't keep Austin McNamara around, even if he doesn't win the job.
Yeah, he was number 292 on the industry consensus board. So outside of maybe the draftable range, but like right there in terms of guys who should have been picked up right after the draft. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Ian, any of these other UDFAs that really stood out to you from this Bengals list? We've got Cole Burgess, wide receiver from SUNY Cortland, Trey Mosley, wide receiver from Michigan State, Cam Grandy, tight end from Illinois State. Now, you mentioned the 2 tight ends that the Bengals drafted, so I think it could be tough for a UDFA tight end to make it. Lance Robinson, a cornerback from Tulane. We've talked about the Bengals still need a little bit of depth at cornerback, so maybe that's a position. Any of these other guys on this UDFA list that really kind of stood out to you in this pre-draft process?
Yeah, there were a few. Trey Mosley I'll touch on because I don't think he'll make the roster, maybe a practice squad guy. But at Michigan State, he's got decent size and vertical ability and explosion. He's kind of a guy who's maybe a master of none, but pretty good at everything. Like, he's got a decent route tree. I think focus drops can be a concern for him. He was never very consistent through 4 or 5 years at Michigan State. So, I think one of those guys who's still waiting for him to reach his potential, but a decent investment. I think Cole Burgess is the guy to watch, a wide receiver. I really do. I think he could make the roster. I would say Aaron Casey is my top candidate on defense. Cole Burgess is my top candidate on offense. I think Burgess actually has a lot to offer. 6 foot, around 200, maybe a little less than 200 pounds, but he had 87 catches, over 1,500 yards in 2023. Very productive player. And he ran a 4.4. He had a 41.5-inch vertical, over 11-foot broad. So this dude is explosive. He's fast, and that energy shows up on tape. The energized motion. His strides are so fast, and he can accelerate so easily. And he's got pretty good route running ability. I think, it's mainly confined to in-breakers right now and crossers, but, he can stress the defense vertically. He's shown that he can contort and make tough catches as well. And he's a really good special teamer too. So I think that's gonna be the ticket early on for how he makes the roster. I think he's a very good gunner. He's shown that he's a willing punt blocker. He can get out in space. He can explode and kind of accelerate and close gaps. But then as a receiver, I think there's some upside there too. So Cole Burgess was a guy looking at his film, and I had circled him early in the cycle because I saw the pro day numbers, but I just got a chance to watch him ahead of this podcast, and I do think there's a lot there. I could see him making the roster just by special teams alone, and maybe kind of like an Ashton Doolin type who made the roster for the Colts as a special teamer and then was able to contribute a little bit more on offense later on too. So I like him a lot. On the defensive side of the ball, the tight end, I just don't think there's enough room on the roster for him to make it after getting the 2 rookies in the draft. I think that's kind of tough. On the defensive side of the ball, Lance Robinson I think he ran around a 4.4, a little undersized, but he's a pretty good playmaker. He had 4 interceptions and 7 pass deflections this past year. So he's got the recovery speed. He's got the playmaking chops. Not a great presence behind the line of scrimmage and support, but if you're looking for coverage, dynamic ability, and playmaking, he's got that. And then PJ Jules is another one that intrigues me. Around 6 foot, over 200 pounds, had 13 tackles for loss and 2 sacks in 2023. So one of those defensive backs, and 11 pass deflections as well. So, he's shown that he can make plays on the ball, but he can also come downhill and make plays in support and behind the line of scrimmage. Very instinctive, very quick trigger coming downhill. So I think there's some utility there. And I think at the very least, those skills lend themselves well in special teams as well. So another guy who could have that dual-sided ability as a special teamer and a rotational defender.
I think all these safeties, because Dow from Miami up the road, the Redhawks too. I mean, they're thin there. Yeah, they signed 2 in free agency, but moving moving Dax to corner, I don't know that they're going to keep yo-yoing him and put it, if there's an injury or something, put him back at safety when it didn't work out last year. So you're looking at right now, your number 4 safety is Tyson Anderson, who's never played a defensive snap in his life. And he was a late round pick. And yeah, he's terrific on special teams, but I absolutely think one of these safeties could be a surprise, especially because Tyson's still coming back from the ACL. We don't know what his timeline's like. I did want to point out, because when I wrote a story about the UDFAs, I had mentioned that PJ Jules is going to turn 26 this month, and I got a message from his agent like, "Where'd you get that information?" And I said, "Well, it's on the college website. It says his birthday is May 18th, 1998." And he said, "No, he was born in 2001. He's going to turn 23 this month." But the May part was right, but the year was totally off. And it's not that I doubt him. I totally believe him, but it's like, how does his wrong birthday stay on a college website that long? Like, you would think his parents at least looked at the bio and they're like, "Hey, wait a minute, that's not right." But so I did want to point that out. That was a mistake in my story. I have corrected it. So he is not 26 like Rocky Lombardi.
As someone who's going to turn 26 in August, I sometimes I hold out hope that those are true, because it makes me feel like I'm getting to the age now where the prospects are younger than me, and that feels weird. Yeah. But I'm sorry. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but so it's tough. It's tough. But yeah, it's always good to cross check with that.
Prospects are younger than my kids.
Yeah. At a certain point, it's just like, yeah, this is the way of the world. This is how it is.
This is just how it is now. Yeah, exactly. All right. We did have a couple more questions here. One from Brian, who wants to know, I don't know if this is for Jay or if this is for Ian. When is your first 2025 mock draft? Ian already put out a 25 mock draft, like literally, what is it, the day after the 24 draft, right? You put that out, or maybe the day of? I don't even remember, but you have done that. Yeah, so if we want that information, it's out there.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun class for sure. Just looking at the positions right away, the wide receiver group is going to be strong again. Not as strong at the top, but I think a lot of depth is there. I think on the defensive side as well, defensive tackles, a lot of edge rushers as well. So with the uncertainty for the Bengals at that position, I think they could invest in that. And then cornerback, safety, linebacker, I think in general, it's going to be a strong defensive class too. So it's going to be an exciting one. Excited to see how it comes up. My next mock draft, I don't know when exactly it's going to be. I assume later in the summer. You guys can try your hand at one for the Bengals if you want, but we're still going to be finding our way across the big board and diving deeper and trying to get a more complete accounting as the months progress. So we're still in the early stages there, but we're getting there.
Yeah, if you want to know when mine's coming out, just ask our editors, because it will not be a day before they say I have to do one. I am in no hurry to do a 2025 mock draft.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'm the same with you, Jay. I'll let Ian handle those for the time being, and we can dive in when it gets a little closer to next year. We do want to do a little Jay's Got Stats. Now, we can't exit this episode without looking at some of Jay's stats. Jay, you've got some numbers for us on what we talked about today, UDFAs, and how often they start in the NFL. So what do you have for us in Jay's Got Stats today?
So I want to quiz you guys, but I don't want to quiz you guys because the number surprised me. So I don't want you to be way off. But last year, there were 265 guys that entered the league as undrafted free agents. Now, they weren't all rookies last year. It's guys like Jake Browning. He's in the league now, but he came in a while ago. Just how they got to the league was as an undrafted free agent. Those guys played they started 1,560 games last year. All the 7th round picks, 430 starts last year. All the 6th round picks, 642 starts. All the 5th round draft picks, 879 starts. All the 4th rounders, 1,249. All of those are less than the UDFA. So it is a path. Now, I'm sure part of that's the volume. There's way more UDFA signed than there are guys drafted in the 7th round every year. But still, that's a lot. And even when you look at 265 undrafted guys started at least one game last year, 255 first-round picks started at least one game. So there was more different UDFAs that started games last year than first-round picks. So It's interesting. I mean, every year it happens. You think it, and sometimes it doesn't happen right away. Sometimes, like Ian was talking about, some of these guys are going to be developmental projects. They're going to be on the practice squad this year. And then maybe at some point they do start for the Bengals. But I think it is important, as we're kind of an example here, that we're devoting an entire podcast to the UDFA guys. But for the fans out there, don't overlook these guys. And, we will keep you up to date with what they're doing at OTAs, what they're doing in training camp. Every year, it seems like there's one guy that just kind of flashes and becomes a fan favorite in training camp. So we'll see who that'll be this year. I do like Ian's pick of Burgess. He went to the same school as offense coordinator Dan Pitcher. That can help a little bit for the connection. So, but that number did surprise me. 1,560 starts for guys that entered the league undrafted. I never would have expected it to be that high.
It's very surprising. And I think, look at the Bengals roster construction too. They're paying Joe Burrow $55 million a year. Jamar Chase is probably going to get 30, 35. You're going to need to find a lot of cheap options and alternatives to fill out the rest of this roster. That's late round draft picks, but that's also UDFAs. Like these are the avenues the Bengals are going to have to hit on some of these guys just to account for these other expensive players on their roster. So I think that's a great point to not kind of under assume that these guys can't make the roster, and the Bengals will get some value out of them, I think, if they do. So I think that's a really, really great point. Last question. This is from Chris. This is for Jay. With your time off, are you going to be working on your new book, How to Get to the Front Row of the that is what Chris wants to know. If Jay is obviously a massive music fan, I think most of his vacation will be spent at concerts. Jay, is that the title of your memoir, and will you be working on that while you're off?
No, I will not be working. If I ever release that book, it's going to be after I stop going to concerts, because I don't want to give my secrets away. It's hard enough to work your way down there. And if I got people using my same tricks, it would be counterproductive. But I always said when I was first getting into writing that the first book I would ever write would be on cures for hiccups, because it seems like everybody's got a different, unique cure, and it would be fun, I think, to put them all in one book, and then people can try and see which ones work and which ones don't. But maybe someday a memoir on sneaking. It's not just sneaking into concerts. I sneak in everywhere. I've made a career of it, you could say. So maybe I will at some point put all those thoughts together and see if
is this a Fairfield thing between you and Eric All? He's sneaking onto the field to play with the jugs machine. You're sneaking into concerts in the front row. Is this taught at Fairfield, or like what is this?
He has much more. He has much more drive than I did at that age. I'll say that. And he didn't sneak on. The coach did give him the keys. He just had to figure out a way to get the jugs machine somewhere where it was under lights and he could do his late night work.
I think this was a great episode going over these UDFAs. Ian, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all the work you put into this pre-draft process. Like it is amazing the work you put in. It is amazing how much it helps all of us at PFN and everybody out there on Twitter and everybody who follows the draft to get your analysis and your insight on all these prospects and all the work you put in. So thank you so much for doing all of that. And of course, thank you for joining us on today's show.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys. It's always fun to chop it up with you and talk Bengals, talk football, and talk sneaking in, covert ops, the whole 9 yards. I love it. It's a lot of fun. I'm excited to decompress a little bit next week, but I'm equally excited to get into the 2025 NFL draft cycle for real, because a lot more ground to cover, and the grind never stops. So appreciate you guys. Thank you for having me on again.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Jay, enjoy your vacation. Ian enjoys your vacation next week. We will have an episode next week. We'll have a special guest. We'll tease that a little bit. But we will be back without Jay next week. Jay, enjoy your vacation. And us too will be back in a couple of weeks. Thank you all for listening.